Karen sat on a checkered blanket in the city park, surrounded by her family and friends. The sun shone brightly overhead, casting dappled shadows through the leaves of the oak trees. Her children played nearby, their laughter mingling with the chatter of adults discussing the latest neighborhood news. "Did you hear about the break-in on Maple Street?" one of Karen's friends asked, her voice hushed despite the open space around them. "It's getting more dangerous out there every day." Karen nodded, her eyes scanning the park. That's when she first noticed him, a disheveled man sitting alone on a bench at the edge of the park. His clothes were worn and dirty, his beard unkempt. Anthony, though Karen didn't know his name yet, stood out starkly against the well-manicured backdrop of the park. "We need to be more vigilant," another friend chimed in. "You never know who might be a threat these days." Karen's gaze lingered on Anthony, her mind racing with assumptions. She pulled her youngest child closer, a protective instinct kicking in. The scene shifts, transporting us to a dusty battlefield. A younger Anthony, clean-shaven and dressed in military fatigues, crouches behind a ruined wall. Gunfire echoes around him. With a determined look, he dashes out from cover, dragging a wounded comrade to safety. The action is swift, decisive, and brave. Later, Anthony stands at attention, his uniform crisp and adorned with medals. A superior officer pins another medal to his chest, a commendation for bravery in combat. His fellow soldiers applaud, respect evident in their eyes. Anthony's face shows pride, tinged with the haunted look of someone who has seen too much. Back in the present, Karen continues to watch Anthony from afar. The contrast between the heroic soldier in her imagination and the bedraggled man before her is stark. Anthony sits hunched on the bench, his eyes distant, lost in thoughts Karen can't begin to fathom. "You know," one of Karen's friends says, lowering her voice, "I've seen that man around before. He's always mumbling to himself, probably on drugs or something." Karen's unease grows. She watches as Anthony reaches into a tattered backpack, her heart rate quickening. He pulls out only a half-empty water bottle, but Karen's imagination runs wild with possibilities. "We should do something," another friend suggests. "What if he's dangerous? Think of the children." Karen nods, her resolve hardening. She believes she's protecting her family, her community. In reality, she's acting on unfounded fears and ingrained prejudices. She doesn't see Anthony as a person with a history, with struggles, with humanity. Instead, he's become a threat in her mind, a danger to be eliminated. With a trembling hand, Karen reaches for her phone. She's about to make a decision that will set in motion a series of events that will challenge everything she thinks she knows about safety, prejudice, and the human capacity for both cruelty and redemption. Karen's fingers trembled as she dialed 911. Her eyes darted between Anthony on the bench and her daughter playing nearby. The dispatcher's voice came through, calm and professional. 911, what's your emergency?" Karen took a deep breath, her voice quivering as she spoke. "There's a suspicious man in Oakwood Park. He looks homeless and dangerous." She hesitated, realizing how thin her justification sounded. He's making me feel unsafe." As Karen described Anthony's appearance, her daughter Lily approached, curiosity etched on her young face. "Mom, who are you talking to? Is something wrong?" Karen's stomach churned with conflicting emotions. She covered the phone's microphone, forcing a smile. "Everything's fine, sweetie. Go play with your brother." Lily's brow furrowed, unconvinced. She looked towards Anthony, then back at her mother, confusion evident in her eyes. The scene shifts again, this time to Anthony's return from war. He stands in an airport, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, surrounded by reuniting families. But there's no one waiting for him. The noise and bustle overwhelm his senses, causing him to flinch at every sudden movement. Days later, Anthony sits in a sterile VA office trying to explain his struggles to a disinterested bureaucrat. "I can't sleep," he says, voice barely above a whisper. "When I do, I see their faces, hear the explosions." The official nods mechanically, stamping forms without making eye contact. "We'll get you some pamphlets on PTSD. Next." Anthony's attempts to find work are met with closed doors. His military skills don't translate easily to civilian life, and his jumpy demeanor puts off potential employers. Bills pile up, relationships strain, and eventually, Anthony finds himself on the streets, another veteran failed by the system he once served. Back in the present, Karen ends the call with dispatch, a mix of relief and guilt washing over her. She scans the park, wondering if anyone noticed her call. Her friends continue their conversation, oblivious to her actions. "Did you do something?" one friend asks, noticing Karen's agitated state. Karen nods, her voice low. "I called the police. They're sending someone to check it out." Her friend pats her hand approvingly. "Good for you taking action. Better safe than sorry, right?" But doubt gnaws at Karen. She watches Anthony, who hasn't moved from his spot. He's not threatening anyone, not causing any disturbance. He's just existing. Was that really enough to warrant calling the police? Lily returns, tugging at Karen's sleeve. "Mom, why does that man look so sad? Can we give him some of our sandwiches?" Karen's throat tightens. She looks at her daughter's innocent, concerned face, then back at Anthony. For a moment, she sees him not as a threat, but as a human being, one who's clearly suffering. The sound of approaching sirens cuts through the air. Karen's heart races. What has she set in motion? As the police car pulls into view, she realizes that her actions, born of fear and prejudice, may have consequences far beyond what she intended. The park grows quiet as people turn to watch the unfolding scene. Karen feels exposed, as if everyone knows it was her call that brought the police here. She wants to protect her family, but as she looks at Anthony's weary face, she wonders if she's really protecting anyone at all. Two police officers exit their patrol car, surveying the park with practiced eyes. They spot Anthony and approach him, their stance cautious but not aggressive. Karen watches, her heart pounding as the officers initiate a conversation with Anthony. To her surprise, one of the officers suddenly breaks into a wide smile. He extends his hand to Anthony, who shakes it with a hint of relief on his weathered face. The other officer removes his hat, a gesture of respect that leaves Karen baffled. As Karen strains to hear their conversation, she notices other park-goers beginning to take interest in the scene. A small crowd gathers, not with fear or suspicion, but with what appears to be concern and recognition. An elderly man approaches the group, his walk aided by a cane. "Officers," he calls out, "is everything all right with Anthony?" The name strikes Karen. Anthony. Not that homeless man or the suspicious individual, but Anthony. A person with a name, a history. One of the officers turns to the elderly man. "Everything's fine, Mr. Johnson. Someone called about a suspicious person, but it's just Anthony. You know him?" Mr. Johnson nods emphatically. "Know him? This man saved my granddaughter last winter when she fell through the ice on Miller's Pond. Didn't even think twice before jumping in after her." A murmur runs through the growing crowd. More people step forward, each with a story to share. "Anthony helped me change my tire last month when I was stranded on the highway," a young woman offers. "He volunteers at the soup kitchen every Tuesday," another person chimes in. "I've seen him give his last dollar to kids trying to buy ice cream," adds a man in a business suit. Karen listens, her face growing hot with shame. She had seen a threat where there was only a man in need. A man who, despite his own hardships, consistently chose to help others. The officers are now fully engaged in conversation with Anthony and the community members. They're not interrogating or investigating, they're catching up like old friends. One officer claps Anthony on the shoulder, genuine respect in his eyes. Karen tries to interject, to explain her call, but her voice falters. The officers barely acknowledge her, their attention focused on Anthony and the outpouring of community support. Anthony, for his part, looks overwhelmed by the attention. His posture, initially hunched and defensive, has straightened. There's a glimmer in his eyes that wasn't there before, a spark of dignity rekindled by the unexpected show of respect and appreciation. As the impromptu gathering continues, Karen feels increasingly isolated. Her friends, who earlier supported her fears, now look uncomfortable, avoiding her gaze. She realizes that her actions, born of prejudice and fear, have not only been unnecessary but potentially harmful. The contrast between her assumptions and the reality of Anthony's place in the community is stark. Karen had seen a threat to be removed. The community saw a valued member to be supported. Her worldview, shaped by stereotypes and unfounded fears, is crumbling in the face of this simple truth. Anthony, despite his appearance and circumstances, is more than worthy of respect and compassion. As the scene unfolds, Karen grapples with a growing sense of guilt and the realization that her preconceptions have led her terribly astray. She watches as Anthony interacts with the officers and community members, his humanity shining through the hardships etched on his face. In this moment, Karen begins to understand the true cost of judging others based on appearance alone. As the crowd disperses, one of the police officers approaches Karen. His expression is stern, his posture authoritative. Karen braces herself, knowing what's coming. "Ma'am, were you the one who called about a suspicious person?" the officer asks, his tone measured but firm. Karen nods, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, that was me." The officer sighs, removing his hat. "I need you to understand something. What you did today wasn't just unnecessary, it was harmful. You could have put Anthony in real danger." He gestures towards Anthony, who's now engaged in conversation with some community members. "That man over there, he's a decorated veteran. He's faced challenges most of us can't even imagine. And despite everything, he still finds ways to contribute to this community." Karen feels the weight of her actions pressing down on her. The officer continues, his voice low but intense. "Every time someone calls the police on a person just for existing in public, it erodes trust. It makes people feel unwelcome in their own community. Is that the kind of neighborhood you want to live in?" Karen shakes her head, unable to meet the officer's gaze. She glances around, noticing that some people are watching this interaction, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. I thought I was protecting my family," Karen stammers, the justification sounding hollow even to her own ears. The officer's expression softens slightly. "I understand the instinct to protect your loved ones. But protection based on prejudice isn't protection at all. It's just fear. And fear, when acted upon without reason, can be dangerous." He pauses, letting his words sink in. "I want you to think about what would have happened if we had approached Anthony with the assumption that he was dangerous. Things could have escalated quickly, and for what? Because he looked different? Because he made you uncomfortable?" Karen feels tears welling up in her eyes, a mixture of shame and realization washing over her. The officer notices, and his tone becomes gentler, but no less firm. "Look, I'm not here to make you feel bad. I'm here to make you think. Really think about the consequences of your actions, about the assumptions you make, about the power you wield when you decide to call the police on someone." He glances over at Anthony again. That man has served his country, and he continues to serve his community, even when the community doesn't always serve him back. He deserves better than to be treated like a criminal for simply existing in a public space. The crowd that had gathered earlier has mostly dispersed, but a few lingering onlookers watch the interaction between Karen and the officer. Some wear expressions of approval at seeing Karen being held accountable, while others look uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing their own potential for similar actions. Karen's friends have retreated to a distance, their earlier bravado replaced by awkward silence. She feels isolated, exposed, her prejudices laid bare for all to see. The officer gives Karen one last look. "I hope this experience makes you reconsider how you view others, especially those who might be struggling. Our job is to protect and serve everyone in this community, not just those who look like they belong." With that, he turns and walks away, leaving Karen to grapple with the full impact of her actions. She watches as he rejoins his partner and Anthony, their easy camaraderie a stark contrast to the tension she feels. Karen stands alone, the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. She realizes that her attempt to create safety has instead sown seeds of distrust and division. As she looks at Anthony, now surrounded by supportive community members, she begins to understand the true meaning of security, not isolation or exclusion, but connection and understanding. In the aftermath of Karen's confrontation with the police officer, the park buzzes with activity. A small group of community members has gathered around Anthony, their voices animated with purpose. Karen watches from a distance, still processing the weight of her actions. "We can't just let this go," a woman in a floral dress says emphatically. "Anthony's been part of this community for years. It's time we step up." Nods of agreement ripple through the group. Someone produces a notebook and suddenly there's a flurry of ideas being tossed around. Karen strains to hear, curiosity overriding her shame. "What about a fundraiser?" suggests a man in a business suit. "We could set up a GoFundMe page, spread the word on social media." "That's a start," another chimes in. "But Anthony needs more than just money. He needs stability, a place to stay." The conversation shifts to practicalities. Who has a spare room? Who knows of affordable housing options? Who has connections at the VA that might be able to help? It's a stark contrast to the fearful whispers that had surrounded Anthony earlier. As the impromptu planning session continues, Karen notices her friends huddled together, throwing occasional glances her way. She catches snippets of their conversation. "I can't believe Karen actually called the cops," one whispers. "She should have known better." "We all should have," another replies, guilt evident in her voice. "How many times have we walked past Anthony without a second thought?" Karen feels a pang of isolation. Her friends, who had earlier supported her fears, now distance themselves, as if her actions had exposed an ugly truth they'd all been complicit in ignoring. Meanwhile, the community's response to Anthony continues to unfold. Someone has brought him a fresh set of clothes. Another person returns with a bag of groceries. The transformation is subtle but significant. Anthony's posture straightens. A hint of a smile plays at the corners of his mouth. A flashback interrupts the scene. We see Anthony, years younger but still bearing the weight of his experiences, kneeling beside a crying child in a rundown neighborhood. The child has scraped her knee and Anthony gently cleans the wound, his large hands surprisingly delicate. "There you go, sweetheart," he says, his voice warm and reassuring. "You're braver than half the soldiers I knew." The child's tears turn to giggles and Anthony helps her to her feet. As she runs off to play, a neighbor watching from a porch gives Anthony a nod of appreciation. Back in the present, Karen observes this outpouring of support with a mix of emotions. She's struck by the realization that Anthony, whom she had perceived as a threat, has been quietly contributing to the community all along. His true nature, kind, helpful, resilient, stands in stark contrast to the dangerous caricature she had conjured in her mind. As the crowd around Anthony grows, discussing plans and offering immediate assistance, Karen feels increasingly isolated. Her perception of safety, once rooted in exclusion and fear, now seems shallow and misguided. She watches as her community rallies around a man they recognize as one of their own, demonstrating a kind of security born from connection and mutual support. Karen stands at a crossroads. The easy path would be to slink away, to pretend this never happened. But as she watches Anthony accept the community's help with quiet dignity, she feels a stirring of something new, a desire to be part of the solution, to make amends for her mistake. The question is, how? As the community continues its efforts to support Anthony, Karen finds herself drawn towards the group, propelled by a growing sense of responsibility and a desire to make amends. Her steps are hesitant, her posture unsure, as she approaches the gathering. "Excuse me," Karen says, her voice barely audible above the chatter. A few heads turn, eyebrows raised in surprise. I'd like to help, if that's okay." The group falls silent, exchanging glances. Karen feels the weight of their scrutiny, knowing that her earlier actions have cast her in a negative light. But then unexpectedly, someone speaks up. "We could use help coordinating the fundraiser," a woman suggests, her tone cautious but not unkind. "There's a lot to organize." Karen nods eagerly, grateful for the opportunity. "I can do that. I have experience with event planning." As Karen is tentatively integrated into the group, she notices Anthony watching her from the periphery. His expression is guarded, a mix of wariness and something else, perhaps a glimmer of hope. The scene shifts to Anthony, sitting alone on a park bench later that evening. He's lost in thought, processing the day's events. The unexpected support from the community has stirred something in him, a feeling he hasn't experienced in a long time. Hope. But as he considers Karen's sudden change of heart, doubt creeps in. He's seen this before. People driven by guilt, making grand gestures only to disappear when the reality of his situation becomes too uncomfortable. Anthony's reverie is interrupted by approaching footsteps. It's one of the community organizers from earlier. "Anthony," the man says warmly, "we've got some good news. We've secured a temporary place for you to stay while we work on finding something more permanent." Anthony's eyes widen in surprise. That's very kind," he manages, his voice rough with emotion. The man continues. "And there's more. Karen, the woman from earlier, she's been working non-stop on the fundraiser. She's already got local businesses involved, planning a silent auction." At the mention of Karen's name, Anthony's expression hardens slightly. The organizer notices and adds gently, "I know it's not easy to trust after what happened, but she seems genuinely committed to making things right." Anthony nods slowly, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "I've learned to be cautious," he says finally, "but I appreciate what everyone's doing, more than I can say." As the organizer leaves, promising to return in the morning with more details, Anthony is left alone with his thoughts. He's grateful for the community's support, but Karen's involvement leaves him unsettled. The next day, as preparations for the fundraiser are in full swing, Karen approaches Anthony directly for the first time since the incident. Her steps are hesitant, her eyes downcast. "Anthony," she begins, her voice trembling slightly, "I wanted to apologize. What I did was wrong, and I'm truly sorry." Anthony regards her silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nods. "Thank you for saying that," he says, his voice low. "It means something." Karen opens her mouth to say more, but Anthony turns away, clearly signaling the end of the conversation. She understands. Forgiveness, if it comes, will take time. As Karen walks back to the group of volunteers, she feels a mix of emotions. Relief at having taken the first step towards making amends, but also a deep sadness at the realization of how her actions had affected Anthony. She knows that rebuilding trust will be a long and challenging process, but she's committed to seeing it through. The scene ends with Anthony watching Karen rejoin the volunteers, his expression thoughtful. There's still a long way to go, but perhaps, just perhaps, this is the beginning of understanding on both sides. As the community's efforts to support Anthony gain momentum, Karen finds herself increasingly involved in the fundraising activities. She's throwing herself into the work, partly out of genuine desire to help, and partly as a form of penance for her earlier actions. One evening, as the sun sets over the park, Karen is packing up supplies from a planning meeting when she notices Anthony sitting alone on a nearby bench. Taking a deep breath, she approaches him. "Anthony," she says softly, "do you mind if I sit for a moment?" Anthony looks up, his eyes wary but not hostile. After a pause, he nods, shifting slightly to make room. Karen sits, her posture tense. For a while, they sit in silence, watching the last rays of sunlight filter through the trees. Finally, Anthony speaks. "You know," he begins, his voice low and gravelly, "when I came back from the war, I thought the hard part was over." He lets out a humorless chuckle. I was wrong. Karen listens, barely breathing, as Anthony continues. The nightmares were bad enough, but the silence, that was worse. No one understood. No one wanted to understand. It was easier for them to look away. Anthony's words come slowly, as if each one is being dragged from a deep, painful place. I had skills, you know. I was good at my job. But out here? He gestures vaguely. Those skills didn't mean much. And the more I struggled, the more people saw me as something to be feared. Karen feels tears welling up in her eyes, the full weight of her earlier actions hitting her anew. I'm so sorry, she whispers. Anthony nods, acknowledging her words without looking at her. It's not just you, he says. It's a lot of people, a lot of assumptions. He turns to face Karen, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. Do you know what it's like to be seen as a threat just for existing? To have people cross the street when they see you coming? Karen shakes her head, unable to speak. It wears you down, Anthony continues. Makes you start to believe that maybe they're right. Maybe you are dangerous. Maybe you don't belong. As Anthony speaks, Karen listens intently, her earlier prejudices crumbling in the face of his raw honesty. She begins to see not just Anthony, but all the unseen struggles of those she's thoughtlessly judged in the past. I never meant to end up here, Anthony says, gesturing to his worn clothes and meager possessions. But when the world keeps pushing you down, eventually you stop trying to get up. Karen feels a deep sense of shame, realizing how her actions and those of others like her have contributed to Anthony's struggles. But mixed with the shame is a growing determination to do better, to be better. Anthony, she says, her voice stronger now, I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I'm listening now, really listening, and I'm committed to changing, not just for you, but for everyone I've misjudged. Anthony regards her silently for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nods. It's not forgiveness, not yet, but it's a start. As they sit there, the park growing dark around them, Karen realizes that this conversation has changed her in ways she's only beginning to understand. She's seen a glimpse of Anthony's humanity, his struggles, and his resilience, and in doing so she's confronted her own prejudices and the harm they can cause. The scene ends with Karen and Anthony sitting side by side, a respectful distance between them, both looking out at the darkening park. There's still a long way to go, but in this moment of shared vulnerability, a small bridge has begun to form across the chasm of misunderstanding that once divided them. The day of the community event arrives, the park bustling with activity. Colorful banners hang between trees, local businesses have set up booths, and a small stage has been erected for speeches. The atmosphere is festive, yet there's an undercurrent of seriousness. A community coming together not just to celebrate, but to address an important issue. Karen stands near the stage, nervously shuffling note cards. She's been asked to speak, to share her story and what she's learned. The thought terrifies her, but she knows it's an important step in taking responsibility for her actions. As the crowd gathers, Karen spots Anthony at the edge of the group. He's wearing clean clothes provided by the community, his beard trimmed. He looks uncomfortable with the attention, but there's a hint of pride in his posture. The event organizer steps up to the microphone, welcoming everyone and explaining the purpose of the gathering. Then, with a supportive nod, he introduces Karen. Taking a deep breath, Karen approaches the microphone. Her hands shake as she grips the podium, her eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Anthony. Good afternoon, she begins, her voice wavering slightly. I'm here today to talk about a mistake I made and what I've learned from it. Karen recounts the events of that day in the park, her voice growing stronger as she speaks. She doesn't shy away from her actions or try to justify them. Instead, she lays bare her prejudices and the harm they caused. I saw a man who needed help, and instead of offering assistance, I saw a threat, Karen says, her voice thick with emotion. I made assumptions based on appearance And in doing so, I not only hurt Anthony, but I betrayed the values of our community. As Karen speaks, she notices a shift in the crowd. Some nod in recognition, perhaps seeing reflections of their own biases. Others look uncomfortable, confronted with hard truths. But this isn't just about me or about Anthony, Karen continues. It's about all of us. It's about the assumptions we make, the fears we harbor, and the walls we build between ourselves and others. She goes on to talk about what she's learned over the past weeks, about Anthony's service to his country, his ongoing struggles, and his contributions to the community despite his circumstances. I stand here today not to ask for forgiveness, but to challenge all of us, myself included, to do better, Karen says, her voice strong now. To look beyond our assumptions, to reach out instead of turning away, and to build a community where everyone feels safe and valued. As Karen finishes her speech, there's a moment of silence. Then, slowly, applause begins to build. It's not the polite clapping of a typical community event, but something more, an acknowledgement perhaps of shared responsibility and a commitment to change. Karen steps down from the stage, her legs shaky but her heart lighter. As she moves through the crowd, people stop her to share their own stories or to express support. Finally, she reaches Anthony. For a moment, they stand facing each other, the air heavy with unspoken words. Then Anthony extends his hand. "Thank you," he says simply, his voice gruff but sincere. Karen takes his hand, feeling the rough calluses, seeing the years of hardship etched in his face. "No, thank you," she replies, "for your service, for your forgiveness, for teaching me to see." As they shake hands, there's a sense of a new beginning, not just for Karen and Anthony, but for the community as a whole. The event continues around them, a testament to what can happen when people come together to address injustice and foster understanding. The scene ends with Karen and Anthony turning to join the rest of the event, walking side by side, not as close friends, but as two people who have found common ground and mutual respect through adversity and honest communication. In the weeks following the community event, Karen finds herself increasingly involved with the local Veterans Support Organization. She's thrown herself into learning about the challenges faced by veterans, particularly those struggling with homelessness and PTSD. One sunny morning, Karen arrives at the organization's office, a small, cramped space donated by a local business. She's carrying a box of donuts, a peace offering of sorts for the early meeting. As she pushes open the door, she's surprised to see Anthony there, engaged in conversation with the director. "Anthony," she says, a note of pleased surprise in her voice. "I didn't expect to see you here." Anthony turns, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. "Karen," he replies, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "I've decided to volunteer. Figure I might be able to help some of the younger vets, you know?" The director, a middle-aged woman named Sarah, beams at both of them. "Anthony's experience will be invaluable," she says. "And Karen, your fundraising skills have already made a huge difference." As they settle into the meeting, Karen can't help but steal glances at Anthony. She's struck by the change in him. There's a purpose to his movements, a clarity in his eyes that wasn't there before. It's as if having the opportunity to help others has rekindled something within him. The meeting progresses, with discussions about upcoming events, new outreach programs, and the ever-present need for more resources. Karen finds herself working seamlessly with Anthony, their shared goal bridging the awkwardness of their past. As the meeting wraps up, Sarah pulls Karen aside. "I can't tell you how much it means to have both you and Anthony here," she says quietly. "Your story, well, it's making people think. And Anthony, he's opening up more, connecting with the other vets in a way we haven't seen before." Karen feels a warmth in her chest, a mix of pride and humility. "I'm just trying to make things right," she murmurs. Later that day, as Karen is sorting through donation paperwork, Anthony approaches her desk. There's a moment of hesitation before he speaks. "You know," he begins, his voice low, "when you first started coming around, I thought it was just guilt, that you'd be gone as soon as you felt you'd done enough to ease your conscience." Karen looks up, meeting his gaze steadily. "I wouldn't have blamed you for thinking that," she replies honestly. Anthony nods, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "But you stuck around. You're really trying to understand, to make a difference. I respect that." Before Karen can respond, the office door bursts open. A man storms in, his face red with anger. Karen recognizes him as Robert, one of her former friends from the park. "What the hell is this?" Robert demands, waving a flyer for an upcoming veterans event. "Are we really wasting resources on this? These people had their chance." The room falls silent, tension crackling in the air. Karen feels a familiar fear rising in her chest, the same fear that once led her to see Anthony as a threat. But this time she pushes it down, standing to face Robert. "These people are our neighbors, our friends, our family members," she says, her voice firm. "They've sacrificed more than most of us can imagine. They deserve our support and respect." Robert scoffs, his gaze darting between Karen and Anthony. "You've changed your tune," he sneers. "What happened to protecting our community?" Karen takes a deep breath, feeling Anthony's steady presence beside her. "I learned what real protection looks like," she replies. "It's not about fear or exclusion. It's about understanding, support, and second chances." As Robert opens his mouth to argue further, Anthony steps forward. The tension in the room ratchets up a notch, everyone acutely aware of the potential for conflict. But Anthony's voice, when he speaks, is calm and measured. "Sir," he says, looking Robert directly in the eye, "I'd like to invite you to sit down with us, to listen to our stories, to understand why this work is so important. Will you give us that chance?" The scene ends with Robert, caught off guard by Anthony's dignified response, hesitating at the threshold. The outcome is uncertain, but in this moment, there's a palpable sense of change, of bridges being built where walls once stood. The tension in the room is palpable as Robert stands at the threshold, his anger visibly warring with confusion at Anthony's calm invitation. After a moment that feels like an eternity, Robert's shoulders sag slightly. "Fine," he grunts, more out of a lack of alternatives than genuine willingness. "I'll listen, but don't expect me to change my mind." As Robert reluctantly takes a seat, Sarah quickly organizes an impromptu meeting. Veterans and volunteers gather around, forming a loose circle. Karen notices the mix of emotions on display: wariness, hope, determination. Anthony clears his throat, all eyes turning to him. "I think it's important that we start by addressing the elephant in the room," he begins, his voice steady. "Robert, you're not the first person to question whether we deserve help, and you won't be the last. But let me tell you a story." As Anthony speaks, recounting his experiences both in war and upon returning home, Karen watches Robert's face. She sees the flicker of recognition, the uncomfortable shifting as Anthony's words hit home. "When I came back, I was a stranger in my own country," Anthony continues. "The skills that kept me alive in combat didn't translate to civilian life. The memories that haunted me, they don't fade just because you're back on American soil." Other veterans chime in, sharing their own struggles with PTSD, unemployment, and the feeling of being forgotten by the country they served. Karen, listening intently, feels a deepening understanding of the complexities these men and women face. As the stories unfold, Robert's demeanor begins to change. His crossed arms loosen, his frown of skepticism morphing into one of troubled contemplation. Suddenly, Robert stands up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Everyone tenses, unsure of what to expect. I need to say something," Robert begins, his voice shaky. "I served two tours in Iraq." A ripple of surprise runs through the room. Robert continues, words tumbling out as if a dam has broken. "When I got back, I couldn't deal with it. The memories, the guilt. I pushed it all down, told myself I was fine, that asking for help was weak. He pauses, swallowing hard. I've been angry for so long at everyone and everything. I think I was really angry at myself. The room is silent as Robert's confession hangs in the air. Then, slowly, Anthony stands and approaches him. Without a word, he extends his hand. Robert hesitates for a moment before grasping it, the handshake firm and filled with unspoken understanding. "Welcome home, brother," Anthony says softly. The tension in the room dissipates, replaced by a sense of shared experience and newfound unity. As conversations resume, now with Robert tentatively participating, Karen steps back, overwhelmed by the power of what she's witnessed. Sarah appears at her side. "This is why we do what we do," she says quietly. "Every person we reach, every mind we change, it ripples out, it changes communities." Karen nods, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She thinks back to that day in the park, how close she came to perpetuating the cycle of misunderstanding and fear. And now here she is, witnessing the breaking of that cycle. As the meeting winds down, Karen notices Anthony and Robert deep in conversation, their body language relaxed and open. She catches Anthony's eye, and he gives her a small nod of acknowledgement, a gesture that speaks volumes about how far they've both come. The scene ends with Karen looking around the room, taking in the diverse group of people now united in a common cause. She realizes that this journey, which began with her own prejudice and fear, has led to something powerful and transformative, not just for Anthony or for herself, but for the entire community. In this moment, Karen understands that true security doesn't come from exclusion or fear, but from understanding, empathy, and the courage to confront one's own biases. As she rolls up her sleeves, ready to tackle the next challenge, there's a sense of hope, a belief that with compassion and perseverance, real change is possible.